Letter 4. Flies. Servants' offices, including the housekeeper's room and store closet. The kitchen, and the scullery. Brewing, making homemade wines, cider, and perry. And making bread, rolls, cakes, rusks, muffins and crumpets, and biscuits. It gave me the greatest pleasure, my dear Annie, to hear that your husband is so well pleased with the improvement produced by the removal of the Scotch pines. That he wishes you to follow my advice in other things, and that you have actually ordered furniture for your morning room in accordance with my suggestions. You ask, however, why I have said nothing of your husband's business room, and add that you suppose I forgot it, but this was far from being the case. The reason I omitted it was, that I wished, if he asked your opinion respecting it, you might be able to speak entirely from your own feelings, and not from the advice of another. No female friend should ever, on any account, interfere between a man and his wife. In any matter that falls within your own province, I shall always be delighted to give you the best advice I can, but that is all. Should any quarrels arise between you and your husband, and it would be very strange indeed, if there should not, your best plan is to keep them entirely to yourself, and never to ask advice respecting them from any friend whatever. But to return to your house. I was very much surprised to find that you were annoyed with flies, till I read notwithstanding, all the pains our careful housemaid takes to catch them with saucers of sugar and water. This explained the mystery. It is the saucers of sugar and water that attract the flies, and, indeed, one half of what are called remedies for these little pests only increase the nuisance. Besides, without pretending to any morbid sensibility, I must confess that I always think the sight of the poor flies, struggling to get out of the liquid grave into which they have been entrapped, extremely painful to the feelings. I know it is a law of nature that all creatures should prey upon each other, but I do not like killing creatures by wholesale, when there appears no absolute necessity for so doing. I think if you remove your sugar and water, your flies will disappear of themselves, and, if they do not, you must adopt our kind friend Mr. Spence's admirable plan of putting network over the window frame. So, that whenever the window is opened, either at the top or the bottom, the space is still covered with the net. You will be astonished to see how efficacious this simple plan is, as, though the flies could easily get through the meshes, they are afraid of trying to do so, lest they should be entrapped. I will now proceed to say a few words on your servants' offices, and of these the housekeeper's room generally ranks first. As you mean to be your own housekeeper, I suppose you will make the housekeeper's room marked in your plan serve for a store closet. Also, particularly as your present store closet is in rather an inconvenient situation, and you will find the store closet a most important place in the country, as it is necessary to lay in larger stores of all the common articles of daily consumption than are ever required in a town, where shops can be sent to on any emergency. Your housekeeper's room should therefore have ranges of cupboards and drawers all round the room, to contain the household linen, china, glass, pickles, preserves, and cakes, tea, coffee, sugar, and in short every article wanted by the family, a store of which is kept. There should be a bureau, or desk with drawers beneath, to keep the account books, receipts for bills, and other papers relating to housekeeping, and on one side of the fireplace, you may have a cupboard with iron doors enclosing a range of charcoal stoves, and a small oven, for making any dishes in French cookery, or any cakes or preserves that you may take a fancy to do yourself, with the assistance of your maid, apart from the observation of the other servants. On the other side of the fireplace may be a similar cupboard, containing a small sink with a wash-hand basin furnished with a plug and waste pipe to let off the water, and 2 pipes. One to supply cold water from a cistern, and the other hot water, from a boiler behind the fireplace. Before fixing up the cupboards, the walls should be made perfectly dry, and, if they are not so, they should be battened. That is, covered with canvas strained over slips of wood nailed to the walls, strong brown paper being afterwards pasted over the canvas. This preserves a stratum of air between the walls and the backs of the cupboards, and effectually excludes damp. You may easily know when a room is damp, by its appearance, before you have kept anything in it. If the walls have been whitewashed, they will show various colored stains, and, if they have been papered, the paper will hang loose. No expense should be spared to make a room dry, that is to be used for keeping stores in, as the mischief done by damp is incalculable. Lump sugar crumbles into powder, moist sugar hardens into lumps, saltpeter and bay salt turn to water, preserves become moldy or candied, cakes soft, and linen mildewed. Nor is the mischief done by damp confined to any one part of the house. In the butler's pantry the silver will become spotted, the cellar the wine will lose its strength and flavor, and, in the living rooms, the oil paintings will become blistered, and the books and engravings stained. But to return to the housekeeper's room. In one part you can have a cupboard to open with folding doors like a wardrobe, for keeping tea and sugar and similar articles. There should be shelves in this, on which should stand numerous tin canisters marked with the names of the different articles they contain. In the upper part should be a shelf suspended by cords passing through holes bored in the corners, for loaves of sugar, or any similar articles likely to be attacked by mice. The common tea should be kept in a chest lined with lead, which may stand in the lower part of the closet, and the finer kinds should be kept in canisters. A bag of raw coffee may also stand on the lower shelf of the closet, but after the coffee is ground it should be kept in a canister, and as far apart from the tea as possible, as, if it is near it, it will give the tea an unpleasant taste. Moist sugar should be kept in a large tin canister, the lid of which opens with a hinge. The coffee mill, if in this apartment, must be fixed to some part of the room where it will be quite firm, and yet that the person grinding may have room to use the arm freely, but most persons have the coffee mill in the kitchen, and also a mill for pepper. When anything is to be ground in a mill, of a different nature from what it is generally used for, the mill should be first cleaned by grinding in it a hard crust of bread. A similar cupboard should be set aside for the soap and candles. In this there should be some strong hooked nails driven into the wall, for the kitchen candles, and a kind of bench or wooden stand for the boxes containing mold candles, if you use any, though most persons now prefer the composition or stearine candles with plaited wicks, as they do not require snuffing. These candles, and those of wax or spermaceti, may be kept a long time without injury, if they are covered with paper within the box, to prevent them from becoming discolored, which they will soon be, if much exposed to the air. But, tallow candles of all kinds should never be kept more than 6 months, as, when old, they are very apt to gutter. Soap, also, should never be kept too long, or too dry. It is true that, when used too new, it wastes away very rapidly, yet, if it is kept more than 6 months, and particularly if it becomes too dry, it cracks and shrinks so much, as to render it very troublesome to use, and nearly double the quantity is required. Dried currants and raisins, for cakes and puddings, should be kept in canisters in another closet, and almonds and raisins for dessert in boxes. Sage and other herbs, I have found keep best in powder, after they have been dried in an oven. Every leaf should be pulled off separately into a kind of tray made of tin, and put into an oven when about the right heat for baking bread. As soon as the leaves are dry enough to rub into powder, they should be crushed, and then put into wide-mouthed bottles, which should lie carefully corked. Herbs thus prepared will keep good, without losing their flavor for years, and they have the advantage of being always ready for use when wanted, without the smallest particle of dust. As I think, you have told me you are several miles from a town, it will be necessary to recollect everything that may be wanted, when you send there, to avoid the inconvenience of sending frequently. For this purpose, I think you will find it useful to have a slate hanging up beside your desk in the housekeeper's room, on which you can write down the name of any article that you find is nearly exhausted when you are giving it out. Your kitchen appears, by the plan you have sent me, to be of a very good size, and well lighted, which is essential to both comfort and cleanliness. As it is impossible for the cooking to be performed properly, or the culinary vessels to be kept clean, without abundance of light. It is also well placed, as it faces the north, which a kitchen should do whenever it is practicable, to keep it free from too much sun. In old country houses, the ceiling of the kitchen is frequently furnished with racks for bacon, and there are hooks driven into the beams for hung beef, tongues, and hams, but in other places these are kept in the larder. In either case, I would advise you always to have a plentiful supply of salted meat in the house, to be ready for emergencies, and I would always have a ham, a tongue, or a piece of hung beef, ready cooked, which will not only be useful for breakfast and luncheon, but will be found a most potent auxiliary in the case of unexpected guests arriving when the larder may be at a low ebb. In the course of my experience, I have always found that there are few things more agreeable to a husband than to be able to take a friend home unexpectedly, and yet to be sure that he will find a good and even elegant dinner, without any bustle or ill temper being caused by his appearance. In large establishments, the sudden arrival of a stranger is of very little consequence, but as your husband has an ancient name to keep up on limited means, and, above all, as you have undertaken to be your own housekeeper, you must remember that, in places where the butcher lives several miles off, and calls for orders only once or twice a week, it is essential you should make such provision as to be never taken off your guard. To aid in this I will, if you like, at some future time, give you a few hints on cookery, particularly on impromptu dishes, which I trust you will find useful, but I must now return to the fitting up of the kitchen. You tell me you shall want a new kitchen range, and ask what kind I would recommend. I would advise you to shun all those that are said to burn particularly little fuel, as they are generally very complicated, and of course extremely liable to go out of order, a serious inconvenience anywhere, but particularly in the country. I should recommend you to have an open grate from 4 feet to 8 feet wide, having of course a contrivance to make the part intended to contain the fire larger or smaller at pleasure, and the grate should be at least 2 feet deep, to allow of a boiler behind the fire, communicating with another on the side of the grate. Care being taken, either to have the boilers fed by a pipe from a cistern, or to fill them every night when the fire is low. It is useful to have an oven on the other side of the grate, not for baking anything, for things never have their proper flavor when cooked in such ovens, but to keep plates and dishes warm. The floor of a kitchen is generally laid with stone, but it is a great comfort to the cook to have a part boarded near a table under one of the windows, for the convenience of standing upon the boards when in the act of cooking. The kitchen doors should be made to open so as to have the hinge next the fireplace, to avoid disturbing the current of air near the fire. As your kitchen is large, you may perhaps be able to have a small range of charcoal pans for French cooking, in addition to the ordinary kitchen range, if you have not something of the kind in the housekeeper's room. At any rate, you ought to have a cupboard in the kitchen, for the cook to keep her spices and other articles in, fitted up with shelves and canisters. There should also be a closet for the flour tub and bread jar, which should stand on a board raised at least 6 inches above the floor, to keep them from the attacks of mice and black beetles. The egg basket and the salt box may also find a place in this closet, so as to keep the general appearance of the kitchen neat and clean. Of course, you will have 1 or 2 dressers for plates and dishes, made with drawers and cupboards below. Every kitchen should also contain a clock, that the cook may see exactly how the time goes, and have no excuse for not being punctual. The scullery should be as close to the kitchen as possible. It should be paved with Yorkshire stone or brickwork, and it should have a cistern of water either over it, or closely adjoining it. In every scullery there should be a stone sink with a plate rack at one end, and under the plate rack should be a slanting drip board with a kind of gutter at the base, to convey the water that drains from the plates and dishes to the waste pipe of the sink. It will also be a convenience to have a pipe carried from the boiler behind the kitchen fireplace, in order to afford a constant supply of hot water over the sink, and to have 2 coppers, one for boiling hams or large pieces of beef, and another of a larger size for brewing. For brewing 12 gallons of table ale at a time, the copper should hold 18 gallons, as about 6 gallons of water will be absorbed by the malt. The usual proportion of malt and hops required for this quantity is 1 bushel of malt and 3/4 of a pound of hops. Pale malt is the best, and it should be plump and crisp, breaking readily, and full of flour. It should also taste sweet. The hops should have no bad smell, and they should be in condition, that is, they should abound in the yellow powder called by chemists lupulin, which makes them feel sticky when rubbed between the fingers. The malt must be crushed or ground before it is used. Fiver water is preferred for brewing, and it should be heated in the copper to about 175 degrees, or rather more. A large deep tub is then provided called a mash tub, in one side of which, 1 inch or 2 from the bottom, is fixed a cock, or what is called a spigot and faucet, with the end in the tub covered with basketwork, to prevent the escape of the grains when the wort is drawn off. About 6 gallons of hot water are then poured into the mash tub, and when it is about 170 degrees, some of the malt is shaken in, a little at a time, and mixed with the water, by the help of a wooden instrument called a mash stirrer. More water is then added, and then more malt, till nearly all the water has been poured in, and a peck of malt is left dry. The dry malt is then strewed over the mass of malt which has been mixed with the water, and the mash tub, having some sticks laid across it, is covered with an old blanket, a piece of sacking, or a coarse cloth, and left for an hour and a half or 2 hours to steep. This is called mashing the malt, and the goodness of the ale depends upon the care with which this operation is performed. The water should never be cooler than 160 degrees, or it will not dissolve the starchy matter contained in the malt, and, if it is hotter than 180 degrees, the malt will be set, as the maltsters call it. That is, it will become changed into a glutinous paste, from which no strength can be extracted. When the malt has been sufficiently mashed, the wort is drawn off by the spigot, and it will be found that the 18 gallons of water have only yielded about 13 gallons of wort, and sometimes not so much. A new kind of mashing tub has been invented, which has a false bottom pierced with holes, through which the wort filters, instead of being drawn off by the spigot, and, by an improvement on this, the hot water is poured through a tube, into the part of the mashing tub which is below the false bottom, and suffered to rise up through the malt. After the ale wort has been drawn off, more water is heated to 175 degrees and put to the malt, to make the beer, if any should be required. While the malt is being mashed, the proper quantity of hops should be steeped in water, having been first well rubbed and separated, and when the wort is drawn off they should be added to it, and the whole put into the copper to be boiled. During the boiling, the whole should be frequently stirred, to prevent the hops from either floating at the top or settling to the bottom, which they would otherwise be very apt to do. The boiling should continue briskly, till the liquor begins to break, the time for which varies from half an hour to 2 hours and a half, according to the strength of the wort. The breaking is known by large fleecy flakes which appear to float in the liquor, and, when it appears, a bowlful of the liquor is taken out and set aside. When, if the flakes part and subside, leaving the wort clear, it is considered enough. Some large shallow vessels called coolers are then provided, and some sticks being laid across one of them, a sieve, or wicker basket is set upon them, and the liquor is ladled out of the furnace into the sieve, to strain it from the hops. The other coolers are afterwards filled in the same manner, and then the whole are exposed to a cool current of air, in order that the liquor may cool as rapidly as possible. When the liquor is about 70 degrees, it is generally tunned off into a large vat or cask, for it to ferment. About 3/4 of a pint of yeast is mixed with a little of the wort, and as soon as it begins to work it is added to the rest. Another mode is, as soon as the wort has cooled to 70 degrees, to convey it in the coolers to a cellar, where the temperature is about 55 degrees, and then to mix 2 gallons of it with a pint of good thick yeast, and put it into an upright 18-gallon cask, the head of which has been knocked out, but which is covered with a piece of flannel, on which the head is laid loosely. As soon as the fermentation has begun, about 3 gallons more of the wort are added, provided it has not cooled below 65 degrees, but, if it has, a pailful must be taken out and heated, so that when mixed with the rest of the 3 gallons, the whole shall be about 70 degrees. When this has been added to the wort fermenting in the cask and well stirred, the cask should be covered and left to work for the night. Early the following morning, the working wort should be tried with a thermometer, and, if it is between 70 degrees and 75 degrees, 5 gallons more of the wort should be added, heated as before to about 68 degrees. Stir the liquor and leave it for 6 hours, and then add 3 gallons more wort at 65 degrees, cover, and leave it for 4 hours. After which, add the remaining wort, reserving only about 2 quarts. This process is very tedious, but it is said to make the ale exceedingly fine and clear, and, if the proportions be 1 bushel and a half of malt to 1 pound and 3/4 of hops to make 12 gallons, it is said exactly to resemble the celebrated Indian ale. If the heat of the working wort be ever found above 75 degrees, the remaining wort should be added cool, and the whole should be tunned out as soon as possible. When the fermentation has gone on so long that the yeast begins to look brown, the beer should be tunned, that is, the yeast is removed, and the beer is put into the casks in which it is to remain, and, in general, the beer is not taken down into the cellar till at this period. The casks are placed slantingly, with the bung out, and they are always kept quite full, being filled up with beer reserved for that purpose, as the beer they contain works out. In about a fortnight all the fermentation will be over, and the casks may be bunged up. According to the Indian ale process, 2 quarts of wort were kept back from that fermented, and when the beer is to be tunned, which it is into 2 6-gallon casks, a quart of this unfermented wort is put into each cask, with 2 tablespoonfuls of flour and 1 of salt. The frothy yeast is then taken off the beer, which is poured into the barrels till it reaches the bunghole, and the froth begins to flow over. As the froth subsides, the barrels may be filled up with fresh beer, and the yeast which flows down should be caught in a vessel placed for the purpose. In a few days the yeast will become thick, and will cease to flow over. The barrels should then be filled up, and the bungholes covered with brown paper. Coated with thick yeast, the fermentation will afterwards proceed more slowly, and in a fortnight the barrels may be bunged down, and the bungs covered, with a mass of moistened binding sand. The Indian ale should be kept 6 months before it is tapped. But, the other kind may be drunk in a month. Homemade wines may be manufactured from almost any kind of fruit, and they are divided into 2 kinds, viz. Those made with cold water, and those made with hot water. Green gooseberry wine is made in the first manner, by crushing the fruit in a deep tub with a fruit crusher, and then pouring cold water on it, in the pro-negation portion of 1 gallon of water to 10 pounds of fruit. It is then left to stand about 6 hours, when the mass, or marc, as it is called, is put into a coarse bag and pressed. More water is then poured over the marc, which is again pressed, till as much water has been added, as will make the proportion in all 4 gallons of water to 10 pounds of fruit. The marc is then thrown away, and to every gallon of the liquor, or must, as it is called, 3 pounds of lump sugar are added, and the whole is well stirred together. The tub is afterwards covered with a blanket, and the wine is left to ferment in a temperature of 55 degrees to 60 degrees. In 12 hours, if the fermentation has begun rapidly, or in 24 hours, if it is slow, the liquor is put into a cask and left to ferment, the bung being put in loosely, and the cask being kept filled up with fresh must, as it works off. When the hissing noise subsides, the bung is driven in firmly, and a little hole is made in the head of the cask, near the bung, which is stopped with a wooden peg. In 2 or 3 days this peg is loosened, to let any air out that may have been generated, and this is repeated, at intervals, several times, till no more air escapes, when the peg is driven in tight. An excellent wine may be made of the giant tart rhubarb, treated in this manner. Ripe gooseberry wine is made by crushing the fruit, and, after letting it stand 24 hours, pressing the juice through a linen cloth. Hot water is then poured over the marc, in the proportion of 2 quarts of water, to every gallon of the fruit before it was crushed, and, after remaining in the tub 12 hours, the marc is again pressed, and the water added to the liquor from the fruit. 2½ or 3 pounds of lump sugar should now be added to every gallon of the liquor, and the whole left to ferment. If moist sugar be used, the quantity should be 4 pounds to every gallon of the liquor. The rest of the process is the same as before, but when the fermentation has ceased, it is usual to add British brandy, in the proportion of 1 quart to 2 gallons and a half of the wine. When currant wine is made, it is said to be best to boil the liquor before fermenting it in the cask. Elderberry wine is generally made with moist sugar, and ginger and other spices are added to it. Cowslip wine is made by boiling sugar and water together, and pouring the liquor over the rind of lemons and Seville oranges, in the proportion of 4 of these fruits to a gallon of sugar and water. The juice of the oranges and lemons is then added, and the whole is fermented with yeast. The cowslip flowers are then added, in the proportion of 1 quart to every gallon of liquor, and stirred up well till they sink. 1 ounce of isinglass for every gallon of liquor is then added, and in a few days it is bunged up close. In 6 months it will be fit to bottle. But it will be better for remaining longer in the cask. Any other kind of wine may be made in the same manner, using the juice of the fruit, when the wine is to be made of fruit, as was directed for the ripe gooseberry wine, and boiling sugar and water, and fermenting it, before adding the substance, that is to give the flavor, with all the other kinds of wine. Cider is made by grinding the apples, and then expressing the juice, which is fermented with yeast, but without sugar. Perry is made in the same way, and both may be made on a small scale by bruising the apples or pears in the deep tub, as was recommended for bruising the fruit for made wines. The scullery, also, generally contains a large brick oven for baking bread. The ordinary size of an oven of this kind is about 6 feet long by 4 feet deep, and it is about 18 inches high in the center of the arch. The floor, which generally inclines a little from the head of the oven to the mouth, is laid with tiles, and the arch is formed of fire brick, set in fire clay or in loam, mixed with powdered brick. The whole being surrounded by a large mass of common brickwork to keep in the heat. When the oven is heated, the faggots, or other kind of wood, which is used for that purpose, are lighted near the mouth, and then pushed on, till they are as nearly as possible in the center of the oven, so that the heat may spread as equally as possible, through every part. When the heat is between 250 degrees and 300 degrees, it is judged sufficient, and the fire is drawn out to prepare the oven for the reception of the bread. As, however, few cooks can be expected to have a proper kind of thermometer at hand, for ascertaining the heat exactly, it is necessary to have some easier rules for judging, and the following, the correctness of which I have experienced, are taken from the first volume of that excellent and useful work, The Magazine of Domestic Economy. A judgment must be formed by the clear red heat of the bricks of the arch and sides of the oven, and the lively sparkling of the embers on its floor. The former criterion proves that the bricks have received enough of body heat to consume that black carbonaceous coating, which the smoke communicates to them at the early stage of fire. The second shows that the principle of combustion is in full activity, and not rendered inert by a cold surface at the top, bottom, or sides. Finally, if the brickwork be hot enough, and the point of a long stake be rubbed forcibly over any part of it, so as for the moment to make a black trace of charcoal, this trace will be burnt off, and the bricks left clear, in a second of time. When the oven is sufficiently hot, the remaining embers are drawn out with an iron hook fixed at the end of a long pole, and the bottom of the oven is cleaned with a wet mop, made of long shreds of woolen cloth, or coarse sacking. The oven is then quite ready to receive the bread, and it should be put in immediately. It generally takes about an hour to heat a moderate-sized oven properly, and it takes an hour and a half, or 2 hours, to bake loaves of the ordinary size. Home-baked bread is generally best when made of what is called grist flour, that is, wheat ground at a mill, and only the coarse bran removed from the flour. 24 pounds of this flour will make about 32 pounds of bread. But it will require 2 or 3 pounds more of the best white flour to produce the same quantity. Bread is made either with leaven or yeast. Leaven is made by mixing flour with warm water into a thin paste, and then leaving it to ferment. When it begins to rise in bubbles, more water and flour is added, and it is again left to ferment, and then more flour with a little salt is added to make the dough. The dough must be kept warm during the whole operation, as fermentation will not take place unless the heat be from 60 to 70 or 75 degrees. Bread of this kind is very light, but it soon becomes acid. Nearly all the household bread in France is made in this way. When yeast is used, the usual proportion is half a pint of brewer's yeast, mixed with a pint of warm water, to 24 pounds of flour. In the Magazine of Domestic Economy, it is stated that the yeast of home-brewed beer is much to be preferred, but it is very bitter in the first instance, and would flavor a large batch of bread. Therefore, it should be washed in a considerable quantity of water, and be set by for some hours till the thick mass subsides. This, if it still continues bitter, should undergo the same process again. The firm sediment will then be good stiff balm, from which all floating water should be poured. Whether this substance, or the yeast from the brewery, be employed, it should always be mixed with 3 or 4 tablespoonfuls of fresh bran, and a pint of warm water, and then be strained through a hair sieve. Bran abstracts much of the bitter principle, and also adds life to the yeast. If the brewer's yeast be flat and lifeless, it may be much improved by adding a pint of warm sweet wort to it instead of the milk-warm water. To prepare this wort, take 3 or 4 tablespoonfuls of ground malt. Simmer it for a quarter of an hour in a pint and a half of water, with a tablespoonful of moist sugar or honey, and a teaspoonful of salt. Let these ingredients digest on a cool part of the grate, or elsewhere, till they become milk-warm, then strain off the liquor, and add it to the yeast, stir the whole well together, and the mixture will be fit for use. When bread is to be made, the necessary quantity of flour is generally put into a deep glazed earthenware pan, and a round hole made in the center, into which is poured the mixture of yeast and water, and slightly mixed with the surrounding flour, so as to form a light batter, and over this is strewed enough dry flour to cover it. I remember, when I was a child in my father's house, I have often watched the cook perform this operation, which I now find is called setting the sponge, and I always used to see her, when she had done, make a cross in the flour sprinkled over the batter, without which she declared the bread would never rise. As soon as the sponge is set, the earthenware pan is placed before the fire, and a linen cloth laid over it. In a short time, the sponge begins to rise, and forms cracks in the covering of flour. More water is then added, heated to about the warmth of new milk, and salt is scattered over the hour. The flour is then gradually mixed with the water, and well kneaded with the hands, so as to form a fine compact dough. Some dry flour is then laid under it, and sprinkled over it, and the dough, being again covered with a cloth, is left to ferment. Which, if the yeast were good, it does in about an hour, sufficiently to allow the dough to be made into loaves of bread. A kind of bread, which is very good for toast and butter, is made by boiling and mashing some mealy potatoes, and then rubbing them into flour, which has been previously warmed before the fire, in the proportion of half a pound of potatoes to 2 pounds of flour. When well mixed, add a proper quantity of salt, with enough yeast mixed with warm milk and water to make it into dough. It should be left to rise for 2 hours, before it is made into a loaf, and it should be baked in a tin. For rolls, warm an ounce of butter in a pint of skimmed milk, and add a spoonful and a half of yeast and a little salt. This will be sufficient for 2 pounds of flour, and will make 7 rolls. The dough should rise before the fire half an hour, and the rolls should stand another half hour before the fire after they are made. They should be baked in a quick oven, and will take about half an hour. The butter may be omitted. To make French rolls, add half an ounce of soda to the above quantity, make them long in shape, and rasp them when they are baked. For Sally Lunns, take 2 pounds of flour, and add half a pint of milk and half a pint of cream, with a bit of butter the size of a walnut. When a little warm, put to it 3 well-beaten yolks of eggs, 3 or 4 spoonfuls of well-purified yeast, and a little salt. Mix the whole together, and let it rise for an hour, then make it into cakes, and lay them on tins, lightly rubbed over with a little butter. Let them stand on the hearth to rise for about 20 minutes, covered with a thin cloth, then bake them in rather a quick oven. For Yorkshire or milk cakes, dry 1.5 pounds of flour before the fire, beat up the yolk of an egg with a spoonful of yeast, add 3/4 of a pint of new milk lukewarm. Strain the whole through a hair sieve, into the flour. Mix it lightly into dough, and let it rise by the fire an hour, then make it up into cakes. Rub the tins with a very little butter, and let them be warm when you lay the cakes on them. Cover with a thin cloth, and let them rise on the hearth, about 20 or 30 minutes, bake them in a brisk oven. This makes very good buns, with a little good moist sugar, and a few caraway seeds or dried currants. Both the Sally Lunns and the milk cakes may be washed over, with the white of an egg, before they are put in the oven. For oat cakes, merely mix oatmeal and water together, till about as thick as ordinary dough, then, roll out as thin as possible, and bake on a hot flat iron called a girdle, hung over the fire. A little yeast may be added, or eggs, This last makes what is called in Scotland car cake. For muffins and crumpets, take a pint and a half of warm milk and dissolve in it a teaspoonful of salt of tartar, subcarbonate of potash, then mix with it 5 tablespoonfuls of yeast. When it has stood to settle, pour it off by degrees, if for crumpets, into 2 pounds of flour with a little salt, stir it well, and then beat it till it looks like a thick batter, and may be drawn out to a great length when you lift up the spoon. Set it before the fire to rise, and when it bubbles up, bake the crumpets on a hot stove, or a girdle. For muffins, take 3 pounds of flour, and roll the dough into balls, and let them rise, before putting them on the iron plate. When the muffins begin to bake, they will spread into the proper shape, and when one side is done they should be turned on the other side. The crumpets do not require turning. Water is often used instead of milk. Potato crumpets are made by adding to 3 pounds of mealy potatoes, boiled and rubbed through a coarse sieve, half a pound of flour, an egg, a little salt, and a spoonful of yeast. I shall now give you 2 or 3 receipts for biscuits. For butter biscuits, warm 2 ounces of butter in as much skimmed milk as will make a pound of flour into a stiff paste, knead it well, and beat it with a paste roller. Roll it out thin. Cut the paste into round cakes with a glass, and prick them with a fork. 6 minutes will bake them. Stamped biscuits are made by rubbing 1/4 pound of butter into a pound of flour, then mixing it with cold water and a teaspoonful of yeast into a paste. Knead it till it is quite smooth, then cover it on the board with a basin for half an hour, and afterwards make it into balls, stamping each with the print. Abernethy biscuits may be made by adding caraway seeds and a very little sugar to the above.